Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on World Photography Day, which is why we are hosting this event on this specific day. And thanks again for joining, I guess, on a Friday evening for people joining from India, which might be our biggest number of, the largest number of audience coming from. We are super excited to host ASAP's first public lecture with the incredible visual anthropologist and art historian Christopher Pinney. As many of us know already, Chris is a professor of anthropology and visual culture at University College London. He has written some of the only and most influential texts investigating the visual anthropology of photography in India, and has been a foremost scholar in the field for decades. So I'm just going to give a sort of go through some of his books, like just give a sense of the work he has done in his publications so far, that kind of builds up to this moment. So it is with his first 1997 book, Camera Indica, that Chris argued and established that photography practices in India is its own discourse. Sort of the proliferation of images, the creative imagination, and the region's own material and consumer cultures and networks created a world that was far beyond the colonial administration's desire for knowledge production and surveillance, and even turned those same imperial modes on their heads. So in his next book, Photos of the Gods from 2004, he traced the development of prints, mostly chromolithographs from the late 1870s onward. Among other things, the one interesting thing that might come up again is Chris presents the concept of darshan, a kind of auspicious scene that is a part of a total sensory experience. Besides the aesthetic context and production process of such prints, Chris also focused on the community in Bhatisudha and their consumption of images of gods. Later, in The Coming of Photography in India from 2008 is a very ambitious book that I'll only fleetingly mention now. The book takes readers back to the early days of photography in India and in a way back to Camera Indica again. And this text seeks to sort of reshape our understanding of the relationship between technical and industrial networks and other infrastructures like transport routes and legal protocols, aesthetic systems and social practices that lead to the idea of photography in India, and also which has become one of the ways in which all media archaeologists are trying to understand moments of technological and economic ruptures or like slow changes over a long period of time. His book, Photography and Anthropology, focuses on the parallel histories of the two disciplines and their eventual intimacy with photography as a metaphor for evidence collection. This might also be interesting for us to keep in mind in today's lecture. And in his more recent publication, and the last one I'll mention, in Lessons from Hell from 2018, Chris looked at printed images of punishments in hell in 19th and 20th century India. It explores what happens when new technologies of image production collide with with other already existing cultural traditions. It traces the sources of the iconography, Jain iconography mostly, that found new expression in late 19th century chromolithographs showing deeds and their punishments underpinned by a politics that seeks to enforce a certain, which is very pertinent for us today, a certain kind of behavior deemed acceptable by the upper caste, like sexual self-discipline, vegetarianism, patriarchy, etc. Of course, this is not the entire expanse of Chris's work at all. I only decided to touch upon some of the works that kind of like just revoking those works kind of might be interesting for today's lecture also. Today, we are going to listen to Chris present material drawn from his observations in central India, focusing on Dalit assertions of presence through photography and how photography transforms the world. We are all very excited for this forthcoming book, and even more excited to get a sneak peek into it already in this lecture today. And welcome, Chris. I think I'm just going to end this and like pass it, like ask you to sort of start your presentation and your lecture. And I hope it's mentioned already in the chat, but people should be kind of writing their questions, and we will collect all the questions at the end, and I will moderate that. And I mean, grab this opportunity also to do ask questions. And I hope we have, I hope we have people from, diverse interdisciplinary fields, or like people generally interested in sort of visual cultures, and that this lecture will be interesting for all of us. Thank you. Hi, Chris. I think.
Hi, thank you very much, Senjuti, for that very kind introduction. I'll just share my screen, which hopefully will produce the relevant slides. And I also wanted to thank, in addition to Senjuti, also Prabhakar and Rahab for the invitation, gracious invitation. I'm very delighted and honored to be one of your lecturers. Okay, I wanted to start by saying making some general observations about the book as a whole, and then read to you a truncated version of the prologue, which explains the title, and then spend the rest of the time discussing three of the short sections that relate to Dalit, visibility, presence, and photography. Oops, so that's not a good start. Yeah, that's a better start. Okay, formally, the book echoes Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida, both in its aphoristic style and commitment to the photographic index and referent. This informs a theoretical and political ambition, i.e. that thinking about photography in India might feed the same ontological desire as thinking about photography in a European context. Ontological desire is one of the things that Barthes confesses to. The aims of the work are thus not localizing, but reflect a commitment to positioning Indian practice in a world system photography, where reflections on Indian practice might be granted the same potential as reflections on ex-nominated, i.e. European and American photographic practices. The direction of travel is thus from rural central India towards the theory of photography rather than the reverse. I'll briefly mention three key themes that run throughout the book before explaining the title and then focusing on three sections of the text that address the politics of the visual and the visual presence performed by rural Dalits. So the first of these concerns the desirability of transcending language-derived vertical models of popular practice as a vernacular in favor of a more horizontal understanding of them as demotic. Popular photographic practice in India is rarely a vernacular negation of dominant class or elite practices, as the model developed by Pierre Bourdieu in his study of French popular photography predicts. Demotic serves as a better descriptor for the popular practices encountered in India, since it reveals a desire to engage with, rather than withdraw from, the cosmopolitan. Telephones, motorbikes, cityscapes, guns, and disco dancing are all visual symptoms of a modernity and mobility that connects rather than disconnects. By contrast, models of vernacularity suit an anthropology committed to the idea of locality and the determining presence of cultural difference. The present work's ontological desire encourages skepticism towards such models of vernacularity, arguing that photography operates within a more horizontal space of demotic commonality that is, and here I'm quoting one of my own slogans, more than local and less than global. Secondly, I seek to show how diversity of practice might be consistent with a strong ontology of photography, i.e. an insistence on some level of medium specificity. I engage popular attempts to suppress photographic contingency and to impose a frame onto the camera's screen. Here I'm invoking a distinction, important distinction, I think, that André Bazin makes, that's very much fully explicated in an Indian context by Ashish Raja Juksha in a brilliant 1987 Journal of Arts and Ideas article. So what's at stake here is the camera's screen, which is quite unlike the frame of other media. But what I'm trying to engage here is what we can do when we encounter photography being used to recreate that banished frame. So both of these involve attempts to enforce symmetry and convention in the face of photography's unruly contingency. A key example is the practice associated with a genre known as Manorat. The god Srinathji, a form of Krishna, is positioned at the center of an ideally symmetrical assemblage of devotees. The images were first produced through applying photograph faces to painted backdrops, then through archaic studio practices involving a trolley with a painting of the god, and most recently Photoshop. And this desire to frame, to banish contingency, can also be widely seen in studio practices and here in this photoshopped image. The desire for the frame is visible also in a pair of yak's tails, or yak tail whisks, used by a Jain guru to establish hieratic presence and frontality, and which I see as a technology akin to an anti-camera. In both these cases, symmetry emerges as a counter to photography's intrinsically unruly contingency, an attempt through an appeal to a ritualized spatial arrangement to escape the uncertainty of the everyday. And here I'm indebted to Geeta Kapoor's work on company painting. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that there may be a diversity of practice, and often that diversity is founded on an attempt to negate what I would see as photography's ontology. So in this case, to follow the dictates of the frame rather than the screen. But at the very moment of variability, what I'm trying to suggest is we are also being pointed to that underlying center of gravity, i.e. the fact that this is all about trying to escape the screen of the camera. Finally, thirdly, the book argues that images and representational practices occupy a notably liminal space in central India, often acting as agents of transculturation. This is an aspect of the much broader quality of the visual that the Bolivian thinker Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui describes in her Sociology of the Image, in which she contrasts the peculiar function of words with the way that images elude the censorship of official language. Her observation, when combined with Mary Louise Pratt's notion of transculturation, helps illuminate the complex contact zone in which images and representational practices often cut across identities in central India and elsewhere. My suggestion is that demotic photography in central India is as much concerned with alt entity as identity. So concerned with alt entity as much as identity. To put these three themes together, we can say that the book has a strong ontological desire, that it is committed to a horizontal, more than local space of the demotic, and that it presumes the liberating space of altentity rather than the crushing constraints of identity. Now to explain the title, and here I'm going to read part of the prologue to the book. One scorching afternoon in 2008, I set out for Nai Sarak in Old Delhi. As usual, the journey there from Ramnagar, a few kilometers away, had taken about an hour, my auto rickshaw stuttering to a halt in the congestion approaching Chandni Chowk. Dismounting by the Jain Bird Hospital, where in the late 1980s I'd gotten myself photographed, together with Madhuri Dixit, by one of the few remaining box camera wallahs, I savoured the bustle and energy. I wandered past the shrunken shopfront of New Gramophone House, where I'd purchased so many remarkable early 78 RPM records over the years. I recalled auspicious finds on their top floor, including a recording of Subhash Chandra Bose speaking to the Indian National Army from Singapore in 1942, and songs from films including Awara and Mother India. I pressed on past the Gurudwara and turned left into the relative cool of Nai Sarak, heading for the southern section where dozens of calendar retailers were stocking up for the pre-Diwali frenzy. Then on my right, in a tiny passageway that served as a shop front, I glimpsed a hand-painted sign that seemed to say photo state. The heavily serifed and irregularly spaced lettering was a fine example of what Botnick and Raja eulogize as subtle technology. Beneath the sign was an ancient typewriter and a battered photocopier. Both looked decades past serviceability, but were clearly still viable and in use. As Sudhir Mahadevan observed, no technology dies a predictable death in India. In his memorable phrase, there is an obviation of obsolescence. There was no one in the shop, so I waited and gazed at this profound tableau, feeling conflustrated. This is an indispensable term that I learned from reading a wonderful PhD thesis on the Awad Punch by Mariam Sikandar. So I felt conflustrated by this deformation of the photocopying service into a name that so perfectly described my decades-long fascination with the ways in which the camera has been embraced by Indians. State conjured both the territory of India that has been my chief interest and the condition or manner of existing that photography engenders. As I gazed further, I reflected on the serendipity of finding a typewriter to complete the Kitlerian Trimurti of gramophone film typewriter. Kittler opens his book with the proclamation, "Media determine our situation," and later asserts that human essence escapes into apparatus. And I've always relished this challenge to anthropological cliches that assert the contrary. Kittler had always suggested to me a triangle with angles that I could never fully connect. On the one hand, I completely grasp the parallels between what he calls the data ratios of both sound and image recording devices, gramophones and cameras, whose capaciousness allowed them to store what was akin to the unconscious in psychoanalysis. On the other hand, I understood the historical entanglement of typewriters and gramophones. There is still a large ancient sign near the east end of Chandni Chowk advertising a building that was once the regional headquarters of the Gramophone and Typewriter Company Limited. Both these parallel pairs. But until this moment in Nai Sarak, I had never, despite Kittler, been able to link cameras with the typewriter. The inadvertent deformation of photo state helped me to close the triangle, and hence I adopt it as the name for this set of reflections on the convergence and disjuncture of allied media practices. Okay, the next section is called Dalit Camera. Walter Benjamin's passing allusion in the work of art essay concerning the parallel emergence of both photography and socialism is developed more fully in his arguments concerning the sense of sameness that photography engenders. His provocations set the stage for Ariella Azoulay's even bolder claim that photography offers a form of citizenship in advance of ordinary politics. The modalities of Dalit photographic practice are several. It involves straightforward claims to visibility, as in the self-photography with mobiles in the halls of Ambedkar Park in Lucknow. This monumental declaration of the indestructibility of Dalit presence, recently brilliantly illuminated by Kajuri Jain, offers several huge bronze sculptures of Ambedkar, his wife, and the later Dalit politicians Kanshiram and Mayawati, situated inside vast Buddhistic stupas. Based on photographs of these individuals, they are in turn photographed as objects of pilgrims' devotion and serve as declarations of presence and persistence. But the ontology of the visual that commits it to record everything positively in a certain shape, to recall Bernadette Boucher, and photography's affirmation of this offers further heightened possibilities for advancing political claims through documentation by the camera's political unconscious. We should be in no doubt that Dalits are stigmatized by aspects of demotic visual culture, which through what Rosalind Krauss calls the two-step of language is able to negate. One of the genres of popular imagery, which Senjuti referred to in her introduction, through which Dalit life worlds are vilified, is Karni Barni, which depict the sinful deeds and their punishment in hell, as the genre of popular print. The Ravi Uday Press image titled Yam Puri No. 2 from circa 1915 contains a whole series of paired images of deeds and their fruits. In the center of the ensemble is a pairing of images titled Menda Bhagkafal, the fruit of killing a ram. The top vignette shows a squatting male severing the neck of a large ram, and the image below shows the consequences of this action in hell. The perpetrator is shown upside down and being sawn in half by two Rakshas, the devilish assistants of Yam, the lord of the dead. Trapped within the duality of deed and punishment, there is little room to doubt that the viewer is expected to respond negatively to the initial action. The clear message of the pairing is that killing animals is wrong. In this sense, the negation offered here mirrors that of the term non-vegetarian, in which the positive valency of vegetarian is affirmed by its negation. An explicit critique of those everyday codes, which are also championed by Karni Barni images, is advanced by the contemporary Dalit academic Kancha Ilaya. Ilaya argues on behalf of what he calls meatarianism against the vegetarianism of high caste Hinduism. The moral codes which Karni Barni images proclaim are for Ilaya reflections of recent politically driven campaigns associated with Brahmanism and Gandhiism, which negated Dalit Bahujan life worlds and their celebration of meat and alcohol. These political projects conscripted religion and sought to impose a single moral code. Whereas Dalit Bahujan did not, quote, interfere with the eating and drinking habits of the people, Hindu nationalism has judged intoxicating drinks as demonic. Brahmanical habits were projected as being representative of the Hindu gods and goddesses, Ilaya writes. Ilaya's celebration of meatarianism, Mansaharam, resonates with much ethnographic reportage, which underlines the extent to which Dalit cosmologies oppose those of higher castes. If the world for higher castes is frequently conceptualized as vulnerable to destabilizing heat, an excess of tamasic guna, whose chief agents are flesh and liquor, for Dalits, this same heat is often viewed as a source of revitalizing energy, a necessary source of sustenance for exploited laboring bodies. Meatarianism as a concept frees itself from the burden of being the other of something that is more positively evaluated. Vegetarianism, which is affirmed, and the non, which negates it. Meatarianism claims its own self-presence. In this respect, we might see it as echoing the presence of the photograph, which is ontologically destined to affirm the veracity of whatever appears in its frame. As Roland Barthes put it, I can never deny that the thing was there. The referent adheres. Consider in this context a photograph of a man in a village setting preparing to sacrifice 2 goats. Taken by fellow cast members, this image was brought to a studio in Madhya Pradesh for photoshopping and records an about to occur balidan, sacrifice, very likely held on the occasion of one of the twice yearly 9 nights of the goddess festival, Navratri. Although the idiom is sacrificial and the goat is offered as a gift to the goddess, its meat is shared out among caste members afterwards and is eaten. The confident and unapologetic stance of the man wielding the sword and his evident pause in what is also clearly a performance for the camera are indicative of the liberatory potential of photography. Unlike other popular media, it can only present what is positively in a certain shape, to recall again Bernadette Boucher. The camera is fated to present Dalit practices as meatarian rather than non-vegetarian. This is a reflection of the ontology of photography. Okay, second penultimate section is called political punctum. Barthes famously advanced the distinction between the studium and the punctum. The former he defined as an average effect, a general commitment without special acuity. The latter punctures or pierces this general regime. The punctum is a wound, a sting which pricks me, but also bruises me, is poignant to me, Barthes writes. The studium in photographs of Ambaram, a rural Dalit, in front of Chittor's Tower of Victory and astride a horse is clear. Barthes wrote that, quote, to recognize the studium is inevitably to encounter the photographer's intentions. And in this case, those intentions involve dramatizing the visit of largely rural customers to the fort at Chittorgarh in Rajasthan. The 15th century Tower of Victory, visible in the background of one, is the central attraction in the fort. The gesture through which Ambaram appears to be suspending the edifice aloft plays with photography's illusionistic potential to displace scale. The horse also alludes to a legendary Rajput martial prowess, this further resonating with the significance of the site. The punctum was described by Barthes as a detail whose mere presence changes my reading, so that I feel I'm looking at a new photograph marked in my eyes with a higher value. The punctum is what I add to the photograph and what is nevertheless already there. What is already there in the photograph of Ambaram on a horse, but what I add to the image is his grimace, his startled and accusatory look. Perhaps it's simply the result of the horse suddenly rearing, but I recognize the look from my many interactions with him. I recognize it as the grimace of a glimpsed freedom after years of repression, a mix of horror and excitement, not a simple grasping of the future, but a kind of astonished fear of its possibilities. It is relevant to add here that in his natal village, I came to know Ambaram as an enthusiastic Ambedkarite and his family as equally enthusiastic students of podcasts on Dalit history. Ambaram's Chittor grimace is also a detail that pierces me because the photograph brings memories of a conversation with Sidhu, an articulate young Dalit. He once catalogued the oppression that village Dalits experienced at the hands of Rajputs, that is, by members of the very caste whose past heroics are celebrated at Chittor. They smashed mutkas, clay water pots, if Dalits had touched them, and imposed restrictions on entering temples. The oppression was deeply felt because of its symbolic power and prohibition. Quote, if we're going in a barat, a groom's wedding party, they say you can't go on a horse because you're Neech Jati, low caste. You can go on foot or on a tractor, but not on a horse. They'll fight us and try and beat us if we go on a horse. One of the photographs whose punctum fascinates Barthes is G.W. Wilson's image of Queen Victoria on a horse. The punctum lies in the kilted groom holding the horse's bridle. The groom clearly is there to, quote, supervise the horse's behavior, pointing to an unruliness of the beyond. What if the horse suddenly began to rear, Barthes asks. The image fascinates Barthes because it suggests the possibility of the horse emerging, of it suddenly leaving its frame to enter the off-screen space beyond. Ambaram's rearing horse, to me at least, illustrates the political potential, or the political power of such sudden movement. Dalit political aspiration has another equine manifestation that is also entangled with photography. Baba Ramdev Pir, not to be confused with the modern yogic entrepreneur, was a medieval Rajasthani renouncer king. Ambaram visited Chittor because it was en route to Ramdevra in the far west, his pilgrimage to honor Ramdev being the reason for his journey. Other Dalit communities are also eager pilgrims. A young Buggery couple showed me several images taken inside studios in Ramdevra, the site of Ramdev's Samadhi or burial. Ramdev Maharaj appears in the painted backdrop flanked by his faithful devotees, Dulibai and Harji Bhati. Within the securely framed space of the studio, there is little chance of the horse bolting, of it rearing upwards, or escaping into the off-screen blind field. Ramdev's parcha, or the proofs of his divinity, prefigure the proofs of photography. In these pilgrimage mementos, the gesture comes full circle as photography delivers proofs of having encountered Ramdevji. Okay, the final section is titled From Divination to the Public Sphere. When I first lived in Malwa in 1982 to 83, I was lucky enough to be housed by my Jain patrons in a small mud-built dwelling in the central chowk. This is the view during the monsoon out of the front doors. A small two-room house with a single light bulb run on a wire from a neighbour's connection. One of its many benefits was its view of the Tediji shrine in the centre of the focal point of high caste activities in the village. You can see it painted in blue on the left there. The double wooden doors at the front of the house opened onto a view of the shrine, which in the 1980s was a simple, open, blue wash construction under a peepal tree. Tedji's story is known to everyone in the village. He is identified as a brave, veer, truth-teller, Satyavadi, whose narrative is located within the present Kali Yuga. He is also understood to be a high caste figure who is often positioned in relation to Baba Ramdev Pir, who has a mainly Dalit following. Tedji was traveling to avenge the theft of cattle by a lower caste when he encountered a cobra who wanted to bite him. Tedji persuaded the cobra to desist until he had avenged the theft of cattle, giving his word despite living in the Kali Yuga, the current age of dishonesty. Tedji then defeated the cattle thieves in a vicious battle and rescued the stolen cattle. Keeping his word, he returned to the cobra, but his body was so covered in wounds from the battle that there was nowhere for the cobra to bite. To fulfill his vow, Tedaji offered his tongue, whereupon the cobra bit him on the tongue and then bestowed a boon of protection from snake bites upon all who worshipped him. All this is shown in popular prints such as Brij Basi Sri Satyavadi Veer Tedaji Maharaj on the left here. Tedaji is always depicted mounted on a white horse, and his identity is visually fused with the cobra whose protective hood looms over the central figure. The battle with the thieves is shown in the vignette at bottom right, and as in all images of Tedaji, a large spear, a bala, is held diagonally, drawing attention to the weapon with which Tedaji defended his caste honor. As with other figures in the Indian visual mediascape, Tedaji inhabits a thick field of interocular citationality. The Brij Basi chromolithograph serves as the exact model for a large mural on the external walls of a Tedaji temple on the road to the nearest town. And this iconography is repeated in the carved stone reliefs present in the village shrine. A photoshopped five-headed cobra was displayed in the temple in 2011, and this in turn formed the prototype for the 30 feet long cotton and Hessian murti, which was paraded as part of the village circumambulation. So on the right, you can see a frame photograph, which is the source material for the towering murti above it. Over the years, I would come to learn that this shrine and the square in which it sat would provide the mise en scène for a history of photography characterized by changing apparatus, practices, and attitudes. In 2019, I would be shown a series of images that dated from 1977. The images, photographed by Krishna Studio in the local town, recorded activities on Tejas Dasmi, the bright 10th lunar day. At the core, the ritual involves a circumambulation by males around the village, during which participants join with tall colored paper umbrellas adorned with cobra logos, which are then placed above the Tedaji shrine. This is all accompanied by ecstatic dancing, and as the procession progresses, by increasing possession events focused on the shrine in the central square, which is observed by large numbers of village female spectators. In 1977, at least, the festival also involved a Matki Ford, a human tower associated with mythology concerning Krishna in his guise as the Makan Chor, the butter thief. Photographs carefully preserved in a village album document male villagers congregating around the shrine after the procession. Later images in the series show the Matki Ford being constructed by 30 or so males in 3 tiers. It was while this living pyramid struggled to take form that the participants became aware of a mysterious presence, a zone of energy of the kind that someone 15 to 20 feet high might exert. The final image in the series, here on the right, provides an explanation, placing the tower at the center of the image and showing some of the many small colored flags suspended from the shrine, which remains out of frame. Parallel to the tower on the left side, a large mottled snake-like stripe sears the image. For the participants in the Matki Ford and the many excited spectators whose presence the image also documents, the photograph affirmed what they had experienced. The Nag Maharaj, or King Cobra, whom the festival remembers, had been the mysterious presence, assisting in its own effervescent celebration. Mobile phones arrived slowly in the village, largely due to poor network coverage. By 2015, they were a common sight. During that year's Tejas Dasmi, the village-wide procession was extensively filmed and photographed, especially by the huge crowd of female spectators who were not part of the male performative excess that unfolds as the growing number of cobra-adorned umbrellas congregate around the central Tedaji shrine. 3 years later, in 2018, mobile phone video clips were deposited with the SDM following the lodging of the first incident report after an explosive altercation at that year's ritual. The incident had involved an attempt by a Dalit to access the interior space of the shrine. Depending on one's reading of the events, the Dalit was thrashing with the spirit and was denied rightful entry, or alternatively was inebriated and was correctly barred from entering by those clean cast participants who were inside. A spear, the bala, associated with the shrine, it is deemed to be Tedaji's, played a central role. In one version of the events, one of the clean class protagonists attempted to determine whether the Dalit was such true, i.e. truly possessed by a spirit, or, as he suspected, drunk, by demanding that the Dalit grasp the spear, which he refused to do. In the other version, the spear was simply deployed as a weapon of high caste aggression and exclusion. It literally embodied, but also visually symbolized, an illegal high caste refusal to permit a Dalit to enter a temple as a constituent part of public space. Matters became increasingly heated. There was much struggling, and the kurta of the chief clean caste protagonist was badly torn. The aggrieved Dalits then retreated and filed an online FIR. Once this became general knowledge, the clean caste met that evening in the adjacent Ganesh temple and vented their sense of grievance about what they saw as a drunken transgression and a profane threat to the sacrality of the shrine. In these discussions, it was agreed to gather phone footage from those present in order to counter the claims in the FIR. In some instances, the same individuals who 40 years earlier had scrutinized photographs of Tejas Dasmi for the visible presence of Nag Maharaj were now examining phone footage to see if they could read into the position of the spear, whether it was being offered as a test or thrust aggressively. In both cases, photography was operating partly within a field of mytho-technical possibility, informed by an established mythic narrative and a pervasive non-photographic iconography. Although photography never reached its final judgment seat in this case, the FAR stalled because the police said they wouldn't investigate. We can still wonder whether photography's truths were subordinated to truths already established elsewhere and through different media. Or did the multiple viewpoints open up a cubist sense of multi-perspectival positions, of photographic events, plural, that held within them the promise of a new sense of the public? Recall Harriman and Luccheti's suggestion that public life is a way of seeing. That question remains unresolved, but it suggests Sudhir Mahadevan's affirmation of the notion of cinema as a switching point between different media. We can see images of Tedaji here jumping tracks. In the first analog images discussed here, the Nag Maharaj ones dating from 1977, the ones with the mottled stripe, photography conforms to ontological expectations that have been established and configured through a pre-existing mythopoetics, through spoken, sung, and written narratives, through folk performance and iconographic traditions that saturate lived experience. A stable iconicity prevails, so that, for instance, Tedaji's spear always traces a diagonal that contrasts with the undulation of the cobra biting his tongue. As a scarce and still novel medium, photography initially shows itself to be highly indebted to and overshadowed by preceding media and templates. But as the velocity and circulation of media increases, so does its volatility and openness to the new. As Kittler almost said, media partly determine our situation. In the 2018 images, in contrast to the earlier images, we see a mythotechnics a hybrid space of the contingent event in which an audience attempts to impose a mythopoetic expectation that is bound to be frustrated by the techniques of the event. The inconvenient fact of the contingent photographic image is that it declines to fully reproduce the mythopoetic archetype. Its evidence is bound to be noisier and to tell us more about the complicated and at times unreadable actions of humans in the 21st century than those of Teddergy many centuries previously. Thank you. That concludes the talk.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this insightful and intriguing talk. Is my thing working? Am I back?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. As well as for sharing these striking images with us, the whole the whole lecture will be recorded. So we are also lucky to have that to come back to some of the very pertinent ideas that you mentioned.